Jax kicked the flat tire of the 1964 Chrysler Imperial and let out a dry laugh. "Ma'am, this isn't a car. It's a boat anchor. The tow truck will cost you more than the scrap metal is worth." The other customers in the shop laughed along with him, looking at the rusty hulk that seemed to be held together by luck alone. But Martha didn't move a muscle. She stood there with perfect posture, her eyes as sharp as a hawk's. "Your generation is addicted to screens, but you have forgotten how to read the metal," she said quietly. "Wipe the dust off that doorpost and check the VIN. Your computers won't find the record, but the government will be at your door in 10 minutes. Jack smirked. He had been identifying vehicles since he was a teenager, and he knew junk when he saw it. But he grabbed a rag anyway, just to humor the old woman. He started scrubbing the metal plate until the numbers began to show. His hand slowed down. The prefix was wrong. It wasn't a standard factory code. It started with the letters XINT. He pulled out his tablet and searched the national database. The screen didn't show a car model. Instead, the display turned a bright warning red. "Access denied. National Security Protocol 9. Jax looked up, his heart starting to race. He really looked at her this time. Who was this woman? And why was his computer telling him that this rusty car was a secret that didn't exist? The sun was just starting to hit the concrete floor of Volt and Vintage at 6 in the morning. Jax moved through the garage bays with the kind of confidence only a 24-year-old with a high-speed internet connection can have. To him, the world was simple. If a car didn't have a computer port, it wasn't worth his time. He spent his days remapping fuel injections on high-end sports cars and laughing at the old-timers who still used timing lights. His shop was a temple of chrome and glass, but in the back corner there was a shadow. It was an olive-drab filing cabinet that had belonged to his grandfather, Arthur. Jax hadn't opened it in 5 years. His father told him it was just old inventory for tractors and farm equipment, so it sat there, gathering a fine layer of gray dust that never seemed to move. The label on the front was faded, but you could still make out the words Special Projects 1960 to 1970. Above a workbench that Jax rarely used, an old rotary phone hung on the wall. It was the color of spoiled cream, and the cord was tangled like a sleeping snake. In all the days Jax had owned this place, he had never heard it ring. He didn't even know if the wires were still connected to the outside world. Tucked behind the modern digital register was a small, faded photograph in a cheap wooden frame. It showed a group of men in dark suits standing in front of a large car in a snowy forest. Their faces were blurry, washed out by time and sun. Jax had looked at it 1,000 times and saw nothing but a boring memory of a man he barely knew. He didn't realize that the man in the center of that photo, his grandfather, was the reason the 1964 Chrysler was sitting on his lot today, waiting to change his life. The morning rush started at 7, just like it always did. A regular named Dale pulled in his old truck, complaining about a squeaky belt. Dale was a man who knew everyone's business in 3 counties, and he usually talked more than he worked. He leaned against the counter, sipping a coffee Jax had offered him just to keep him quiet. "You see those boys out on the highway this morning, Jax?" Dale asked, squinting through the front window. 2 black SUVs, dark windows, government plates. They were down at the impound lot asking about old military junk from the 60s. Jax didn't even look up from the tablet he was trying to reboot. "Collectors do that all the time, Dale. It's probably just some museum looking for parts." Dale shook his head and took a slow sip. "No, these boys had that federal look. Too clean, too polite, and they were wearing the wrong shoes for a dirt lot. They were asking if anyone had seen a specific serial number from a project that supposedly ended 40 years ago." Jax's hand paused for just a second, his fingers hovering over the glass screen. He thought about the red warning he had seen just moments before, but then he shook it off. It was probably just the ATF doing a random audit. "It happens sometimes," he told himself. Dale paid his bill and left, but Jax stayed at the workbench, staring at the wall. He walked back to the old filing cabinet in the corner and just stood there for 10 seconds, his hand resting on the dusty metal. He felt a chill he couldn't explain. He walked back to the counter, trying to focus on a simple oil change, but his eyes kept drifting back to that rusty Chrysler sitting out in the sun. Something was coming, and for the first time in his life, Jax realized his high-speed internet couldn't tell him what it was. Jax walked back out to the Chrysler, the afternoon sun beating down on the cracked leather seats. He didn't feel like laughing anymore. He grabbed a brass brush and a bottle of strong solvent from his workbench. He began scrubbing the metal plate on the door pillar, the scratching sound echoing in the quiet lot. Flakes of rust fell away like red snow, scattering across the floor. More numbers began to appear from under the dark oxidation. XINT 847-64. Jax had never seen a vehicle identification number formatted like that in his life. He went back to the office computer and typed the numbers in with heavy fingers. For 3 seconds, the machine just hummed. Then the cooling fan in the computer tower began to roar like it was trying to take flight. The screen didn't just show a warning this time, it turned a deep blood red. Large white letters filled the monitor. National Security Directive 47B. Restricted access. Contact Department of Defense Historical Archives. The computer made a long, high-pitched beep, and then the screen went completely black. The machine was dead. Jax turned around and saw Martha standing in the office doorway. She hadn't moved an inch, her hands resting calmly on her old leather purse. "I told you," she said, her voice low and steady. "That car doesn't exist on your internet. It was built in a basement beneath a building that isn't on any map. It was designed to carry people who were never supposed to be found, across borders that were never supposed to be crossed." Jax looked at the dead monitor, then back at the rusty car outside. His hands were shaking, and the cocky smile he had worn all morning was gone. He realized he wasn't just looking at a piece of junk. He was looking at a ghost. Jax grabbed a specialized sanding block from his cabinet. He needed to see what was actually underneath that thick red crust. As he pressed the tool against the frame, the sparks that flew off weren't the dull orange of old iron. They were a brilliant, blinding white. Jax pulled back, his eyes wide. "This isn't steel," he whispered, rubbing the spot with a clean cloth. The metal underneath didn't shine like chrome. It had a dull, grayish glow that looked like it belonged on a jet fighter. "This is a titanium alloy," he said, looking at Martha. "You can't even weld this in a normal shop. This stuff costs a fortune." Martha nodded slowly, a small smile finally touching her lips. "That's because it wasn't built for a showroom, Jax. It was built for a ghost." Jax moved to the front and unlatched the heavy hood. It felt twice as heavy as it should have. When he swung it open, he didn't find a standard V8. The engine block was painted a deep military green, and the fuel lines were wrapped in stainless steel braiding that looked like it belonged on a Boeing 707. The spark plugs were shielded with heavy metal caps to prevent radio interference. There was no air filter, just a massive high-pressure intake system that looked like it could swallow a bird. Martha leaned over the fender, her fingers tracing the valve cover. "We called it the Mercury 14, she said. In 1964, we needed a car that could carry a family across the Berlin Wall at 100 miles an hour without showing up on any radar. This car didn't just drive through the border, it vanished through it." Jax reached out and touched the cold metal of the intake. He realized his grandfather hadn't just been a mechanic. He had been an architect for the shadows. Jax's modern tablet, which had been sitting on the workbench, suddenly began to vibrate so hard it nearly fell off the edge. He picked it up and saw the screen was flickering with lines of green code that looked like falling rain. Then a single text message popped up from a number that was just a string of zeros. "Do not touch the VIN," it said. "Leave the vehicle immediately." Jax felt a cold drop of sweat roll down his back. He tried to turn the tablet off, but the power button didn't work. Another message appeared, filling the screen in bold black letters. "We are watching." Jax looked around the shop. Everything looked the same, but the air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. He looked up at the security cameras he had installed just last month. The little blue lights that usually blinked were now a solid, glowing red. Someone had taken control of his entire shop from the outside. Martha grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age. "Stop fighting the machine, Jax," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They knew the moment you scrubbed that plate. Digital footprints are like sirens to people like them. Put the tablet down and walk away from the car." Jax set the device on the counter, his hands shaking. Outside on the rural highway, he heard the faint sound of tires on gravel, but there were no headlights, just the low, deep hum of a heavy engine idling in the darkness. He realized then that the world he thought he knew, a world of apps and easy answers, had just been replaced by a much darker reality. They weren't just coming for the car. They were coming for the secret it carried. Two black SUVs pulled into the gravel lot of the shop at the exact same time, moving like they were part of a dance that only they knew the music to. They didn't just park, they surrounded the entrance, blocking Jax's only way out. When the engines cut off, the silence that followed was so heavy that Jax felt his ears ring. There was no sound of birds, no noise from the highway nearby. There was only the hot metallic ticking of the SUV engines cooling down in the afternoon air. Four men stepped out of the vehicles. They wore dark suits and crisp white shirts that looked strange and out of place in a world of grease and dust. They didn't walk like regular people. They moved with a calculated precision, their eyes constantly scanning the corners, the rooftops, and Jax's hands. The lead agent was a man in his 50s with short silver hair that caught the light like wire. He had a face that looked like it had been carved out of a piece of gray granite, with no lines of smiling or tiredness. He walked straight toward the Chrysler Imperial, ignoring Jax completely for a moment. He reached out a hand covered in a black leather glove and touched the rusty fender with a gentleness that was almost religious. "Mr. Jax," the man said, and his voice was a low, steady hum like a high-powered engine idling. "I need you to step away from the vehicle right now. Put your tools on the ground and hand over any records, digital or paper, related to this serial number." Jax felt his throat go dry instantly. He looked at the agents, who were now forming a half-circle around him. He looked at his tablet on the counter, which was still glowing with that red national security warning. "I was just doing my job," Jax stammered, feeling the weight of authority crushing his confidence. "I'm just a mechanic. I didn't know a piece of junk could cause this much trouble." A second agent, younger with a cold stare, took a step forward and reached for the hood latch of the Chrysler. He looked hungry to see what was hidden inside. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air like the crack of a whip. "Get your hand off that latch, recruit. You don't have the security clearance to touch what is under that metal." Martha stepped out from the shadows of the office. She didn't look like a frail old customer anymore. She walked with a straight back and her chin held high, an authority coming off her like heat from a radiator. The lead agent turned quickly, his hand moving by pure instinct toward the inside of his jacket. He stopped halfway. His eyes met Martha's, and for a second, the man made of stone looked human. He blinked, surprise breaking through his cold expression. "Martha," he whispered, and the name seemed heavy in his mouth. "The files said you had retired to a farm in Kentucky after the 7th floor debrief back in 1980. They said you were never coming back to the field." Martha walked up to him, the sound of her boots on the concrete echoing like a ticking clock. "Files say a lot of things, Agent Miller," she replied, stopping just inches from him, "but this car belongs to the Mercury project. It was built in secret, it served in silence, and now it must be treated with the respect it earned." Miller stood in absolute silence. His men looked at each other, clearly confused. They had never seen their boss back down or lose his cool for anyone. "Ma'am, the official record says everyone from the Mercury unit died in the Berlin accident in 1977, Miller said, and his voice now had a tone of respect that Jax had never heard from a man in that position. Martha looked at the black SUVs and then back at the rusty Chrysler. "We didn't die, Miller. We just waited in the shadows until the metal called us back." Miller looked at the car. He didn't see a piece of junk anymore. He saw the Mercury 14, a machine that had crossed the most dangerous borders in the world, carrying secrets and people that changed the course of history. He saw the battle scars hidden under the rust and felt the weight of the sacrifice Martha and her team had made. He turned to his men and made a short, sharp motion with his hand. "Stand down," he ordered. "Now!" The agents hesitated for a split second before taking 3 steps back, their hands relaxing away from their weapons. Miller looked at Jax and then focused back on Martha. "I have direct orders to seize any experimental technology from 1964 found in this region, Martha. If my superiors find out I left the Mercury 14 here, my career ends today." Martha put her hand on Miller's shoulder, a gesture of old friendship mixed with a silent command. "Then tell them you followed a false lead. Give me 24 hours. That is the time I need to put this machine in a place where it will never be used for war again." Miller took a deep breath, looking at his military-grade wristwatch. 24 hours, he said finally. After that, I can't hold back the transport trucks and the recovery team. If this car is still here tomorrow afternoon, we are taking it, with or without your permission." Martha nodded her head slightly. "That is all I need, Miller." The lead agent didn't say another word. He turned, got into the SUV, and his men followed him like shadows. As the vehicles pulled out of the lot, leaving only a cloud of dust and the sound of the gravel settling back into place, Jax felt the air finally return to his lungs. He felt like he had just witnessed something that shouldn't exist in the modern world. He looked at Martha, who was now stroking the hood of the car as if she were comforting an old friend who had survived a storm. "You did very well, Miller," she whispered to the wind. Jax walked over to her, his legs still a little shaky. "Who are you really?" he asked, his voice cracking. Martha looked at him, and Jack saw the reflection of 1,000 dark roads and dangerous missions in her eyes. "I am just someone who remembers what the rest of the world prefers to forget, Jax, and your grandfather was the man who made our escapes possible. Now stop staring at me and get your tools. We have a lot of work to do, and the clock is ticking against us." Jax looked at the Chrysler, then at the dead computer in the office, and realized his life as a mall shop mechanic was over. He was now part of something much bigger, something that money couldn't buy and that radars could never detect. He was the new guardian of the Mercury 14. The sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long orange shadows across the gravel lot. The dust from Agent Miller's SUVs had finally settled, but the air still felt electric. Martha didn't say a word as she walked over to the driver's side of the Chrysler. She pulled a heavy silver key from her purse, one that looked more like it belonged to a bank vault than a car. Jax watched, holding his breath, as she climbed into the cracked leather seat. He expected the old engine to groan and struggle, but when Martha turned the key, the sound that came out made his hair stand on end. It wasn't the chugging sound of an old V8. It was a high-pitched, smooth whistle that grew into a powerful roar, sounding more like a small jet engine than a car. The rust-covered body shook for a second, and then the machine settled into a steady, rhythmic hum that Jax could feel in the soles of his boots. It was the sound of hidden power, a sleeping giant that had just been woken up after 40 years of silence. Martha looked out the window at Jax, her expression soft for the first time. "You have your grandfather's eyes, Jax," she said over the whistle of the engine. "He always looked at a machine like he was trying to hear its heart beating." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of oily silk. She tossed it to him, and Jax caught it with both hands. "Keep this safe," she said. "It's the only part of the Mercury 14 that the government never accounted for." Before Jax could ask what it was, Martha shifted the heavy gear lever into drive. The tires didn't spin or kick up gravel. The car just surged forward with an incredible, silent force. He watched the red taillights fade into the distance until they were just two small dots on the dark highway. Jack stood alone in the middle of the lot, the silence of the evening feeling heavier than ever. He looked down at the object Martha had given him. He unwrapped the silk and found a small, heavy piece of metal. It was a valve, machined with such perfect precision that it looked like a piece of jewelry. But it wasn't made of steel or brass. It had that same dull, grayish glow of the titanium alloy he had seen on the car's frame. He turned it over in his fingers and felt his heart skip a beat. Stamped into the base of the metal were two small letters, AM, his grandfather's initials. Jax walked back into his shop, but it didn't feel like his shop anymore. The bright LED lights and the expensive digital diagnostic tools looked cheap and shallow compared to the piece of metal in his hand. He realized that the Volt and Vintage wasn't just a business he had inherited. It was a sanctuary for secrets that had protected the world long before he was born. The air in the garage smelled of ozone and old oil, a scent that now felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. Jax looked at the old filing cabinet in the corner, the one he had ignored for years. He realized that the rust on the outside didn't matter. It was what was hidden underneath that changed everything. The world felt much bigger now and much more dangerous. But for the first time in his life, Jax didn't feel like a kid playing with cars. He felt like a man who had just been given a mission. Jax stood in the middle of his silent shop, the titanium valve feeling heavy in his palm. He looked at the initials AM and felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent his whole life thinking his grandfather, Arthur Mercer, was just a quiet man who fixed tractors and minded his own business. Now, he knew that was a lie. He walked over to the back corner of the garage, where the olive-drab filing cabinet sat under a thick layer of gray dust. For 5 years he had treated it like a piece of furniture, something to lean brooms against. His father had told him never to bother with it, that it was just boring inventory records for farm equipment from the 60s. Jax reached out and touched the cold metal. He wiped away the dust, revealing the faded label. Special Projects 1960 to 1970. He tried to pull the top drawer open, but it was locked tight. He didn't have a key, and he knew a screwdriver wouldn't work on this heavy military-grade steel. He looked down at the titanium valve in his hand. It was perfectly machined, a beautiful piece of engineering. He turned it over and noticed a small, hexagonal shape on the bottom, right near the initials. He looked at the lock on the cabinet drawer. It didn't have a normal keyhole. Instead, it had a strange, hexagonal indentation that matched the valve perfectly. Heart pounding, Jax pressed the bottom of the valve into the lock. It clicked. A heavy mechanism moved inside the cabinet, and the drawer popped open an inch. A smell drifted out, the scent of old paper, vinegar, and machine oil. Jax pulled the drawer the rest of the way open. Inside were hundreds of manila folders, organized neatly by year. He pulled one out at random, labeled Mercury 14 Fuel System Modifications. He opened it on his workbench under the bright LED lights. It wasn't a parts list for a tractor. It was a detailed blueprint of a Chrysler Imperial engine bay, but the engine drawn there wasn't a normal piston engine. It was a turboshaft engine, a derivative of a helicopter turbine adapted to fit under the hood. Stamped across the top in big red letters was "Classified, Eyes Only." Jax's hands were shaking as he read the notes written in the margin in his grandfather's precise handwriting. Titanium alloy frame reinforcement required to handle torque. Acoustic dampening needed on intake to hide the whistle. Fuel system modified for high-altitude starts. He pulled another folder, this one filled with photographs. They showed blurred images of strange-looking cars being tested on snowy fields at night. In one photo, his grandfather was standing next to a prototype, wearing a thick parka, holding a clipboard and smiling. Jax looked over at the faded photograph behind the cash register, the one he had ignored for years. He took it down and looked closely. Now he understood. The large car in the snowy forest wasn't just a car, it was the Mercury 14, and the blurry men in suits weren't just random businessmen, they were agents and engineers. His grandfather was right in the center, looking at the hood latch. Jax realized that his grandfather hadn't just been hiding a secret, he had been building a sanctuary for the truth. This cabinet was his real legacy, and it told a story of sacrifice and courage that Jax was just beginning to understand. He looked at the high-tech computer diagnostic tools on his workbench and felt foolish. His grandfather had been doing things in the 60s with no computers that Jax could barely dream of doing today. He was the grandson of a master of the shadows, and he had a lot to learn. Jax sat at the workbench, his head spinning as he looked at the blueprints. The shop was so quiet he could hear the humming of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then a sound cut through the air that made him jump nearly a foot off his stool. It was a loud mechanical bell. Rrr-ring, rrr-ring. It was harsh and old-fashioned, a sound that didn't belong in a world of silent smartphones. Jax turned his head slowly toward the back wall. The cream-colored rotary phone was shaking against the wood. In all the years his family had owned this shop, that phone had never made a sound. It was supposed to be a decoration, a relic from a time before Jax was even born. He walked toward it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached out a hand that was covered in gray dust and lifted the heavy plastic receiver. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice shaking. At first, there was only the sound of heavy static, like a radio tuned between stations. Then a voice came through. It was an old man's voice, deep and gravelly, with a formal military tone that reminded Jax of Agent Miller. "This line has been inactive for 38 years, the voice said. If it is ringing now, it means someone used a mercury valve to open the archive. Is this the grandson?" Jax swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was full of sand. "Yes," he said, "this is Jax." The voice on the other end let out a long, shaky breath. Then listen carefully, Jax. Your grandfather, Arthur Mercer, was never just a mechanic who fixed tractors. To the world, he was a businessman. To us, he was the getaway engineer. He was the only man who could take a luxury sedan and turn it into a ghost that could outrun a Soviet interceptor. He saved more American lives with a wrench than most generals did with a tank. Jax leaned his forehead against the cool plastic of the phone. "Why didn't he tell me?" he asked. "Why keep all this hidden?" "Because some truths are too dangerous to live with," the old man replied. Arthur built a fail-safe. He knew that one day the Mercury operators would need a witness. He knew that the government would try to erase them from the history books to hide the methods they used. He set up this phone and that filing cabinet so that if a Mercury 14 ever returned to this shop, the truth would finally surface. Jax looked at the titanium valve sitting on the counter. He felt the weight of 3 generations of secrets pressing down on his shoulders. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who owes your grandfather everything," the voice said. "There is an announcement coming, Jax. A declassification. The people who ran the Mercury project are old now. They are dying from heart disease and time. They want the world to know what those operators sacrificed before the last of them is gone. Be ready. You are the advocate now. You are the one who has the proof." The line went dead with a sharp, metallic click. Jack stood there for a long time, the silent receiver still pressed to his ear. He looked around his shop and realized that every tool, every cabinet, and even the walls themselves were part of a story he was just beginning to tell. He wasn't just Jax the mechanic anymore. He was the guardian of a legacy that had changed the world in the dark. Jax was still standing by the old cream-colored phone, his hand resting on the receiver, when the small bell above the shop door rang. It was a sharp, clear sound that made him turn around quickly. A man was standing in the doorway, framed by the late afternoon light. He looked to be in his 80s, moving slowly with the help of a wooden cane. He wore a faded blue flight jacket with patches on the shoulders that Jax didn't recognize, and a cap that said "Veteran" in gold letters. The man didn't look at the expensive sports cars or the digital tools. His eyes went straight to the back corner of the shop, landing on the olive-drab filing cabinet and the old photograph sitting on the counter. "You have your grandfather's chin," the man said, his voice sounding like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Jax stepped forward, wiping his dusty hands on his jeans. "Did you know him?" he asked. The old man nodded slowly, taking a few steps into the garage. He stopped in front of the photograph and looked at it for a long time. "I'm the one third from the left," he said, pointing a shaky finger at a blurry figure in the snowy forest. "My name is Frank, but back then they called me Pelican 3. I was the pilot." Jax looked at the photo, then back at Frank. "A pilot? For a car?" Frank let out a short, quiet laugh. "That Chrysler wasn't just a car, son. It was a low-altitude interceptor on wheels. I drove it across the border in November of 1964. We had 3 scientists in the back seat and half the East German police on our tail. They had roadblocks every 5 miles and spotlights that could see a rabbit in the grass." Jax leaned against the workbench, hanging on every word. "How did you get through?" he asked. Frank smiled, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away from his face. "Because of your grandfather, Arthur. He had installed a thermal masking system that hid the heat of the engine. He modified the suspension so we could fly over plowed fields at 90 miles an hour without breaking an axle. When I hit the switch he told me to hit, the car didn't just go fast. It became a ghost. The radar went blank, the spotlights couldn't find our reflection, and we slipped through the woods like smoke." Frank reached out and touched the metal of the filing cabinet. "Arthur was the only man we trusted with our lives. He didn't just fix machines. He gave them souls. He told me once that if the world ever forgot what we did, he would make sure the evidence stayed right here in this shop." Jax felt a surge of pride he had never felt before. He looked at the old man's jacket and realized that these weren't just stories from a movie. These were the men who had kept the world safe while everyone else was sleeping. "Why are you here now, Frank?" Jax asked quietly. Frank looked at the door, then back at Jax. "Because Martha called me. She told me the Mercury 14 had come home. She told me that Arthur's grandson was the one who scrubbed the rust off the truth. I had to see for myself if the legacy was in good hands." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver coin with a winged car engraved on it. He set it on the counter next to the titanium valve. Tell her I remember, Jax. Tell Martha that Pelican 3 still remembers every mile of that road. He turned and walked back toward the door, his cane tapping rhythmically on the concrete. As he disappeared into the evening light, Jax felt like the shop was full of people he couldn't see. He looked at the coin, the valve, and the blueprints, and he knew that he wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was a witness to a war that never made the news. Jax stood in the silence of the garage, the silver coin from the pilot resting next to the titanium valve on his workbench. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a world he didn't know existed just a few hours ago. He walked back to the filing cabinet, his hands moving with a new kind of respect. He reached into the very back of the bottom drawer, feeling around the cold metal frame. His fingers brushed against something taped to the underside. He pulled it loose. It was a thick, yellow envelope sealed with heavy wax and his grandfather's personal stamp. On the front, in the same precise handwriting he had seen on the blueprints, were the words, "To whoever carries the name forward." Jack sat down on his stool and broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key. The letter began simply. "If you are reading this, someone finally asked the right questions," Arthur had written. "Someone finally looked past the rust and saw the machine underneath. Good. What we did in 1964 was necessary. The Mercury 14 wasn't just a car, it was a lifeline. The men and women who rode in that machine were heroes who could never be named. When the project ended, the government wanted us to forget. They wanted us to burn the records and walk away like it never happened. But some sacrifices deserve to be remembered, even if that memory comes 50 years late." Jax looked at the brass key. The letter explained it was for a safe deposit box at the First National Bank in town, Box 347. Inside, Arthur had hidden the original mission logs, the names of the families they had saved, and the technical secrets that the government had tried to bury. "My shop was more than a business," the letter continued. "It was a safe house. I kept the evidence here so that when the time was right, someone could tell the truth. I trusted you with this shop because I knew you had the skill to see the details, Jax. Now, I'm trusting you with our history. Don't let them erase us again." Jack set the letter down and looked at the photographs of the young soldiers in the jungle fatiguing beside the car. He realized that for his whole life, the gun shop and the garage hadn't just been about fixing things. They had been about protecting people. His grandfather hadn't been a quiet businessman. He had been a guardian. Jax looked at the brass key and then at the rotary phone on the wall. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just a kid who liked fast cars anymore. He was the keeper of a legacy that had saved lives in the dark. He gathered the documents, locked them in the office safe, and realized that tomorrow he wouldn't be doing oil changes. He would be going to the bank to reclaim a history that belonged to his family and to the nation. The next morning came with a cold, gray light that seemed to match the heavy feeling in Jax's chest. He didn't make coffee, he didn't check his emails, he just sat in his truck outside the First National Bank, waiting for the doors to open at 9 o'clock sharp. In his pocket, the small brass key felt like it was glowing with heat. When the bank manager finally let him in, Jax felt like every person in the lobby was watching him. He followed the manager down a long, quiet hallway into the basement vaults. The air down there was still and smelled like cold metal and old paper. The manager slid the heavy steel door open, and Jax stepped into a room filled with hundreds of small silver doors. He found box 347. He slid the key into the lock, and with a soft click, the door swung open. Inside was a stack of papers tied with a simple piece of string. Jax carried the box to a small private room and sat down. He didn't know what he expected to find, but as he untied the string, he realized he was looking at the beating heart of a secret that had been kept for 50 years. There were handwritten letters from families in West Berlin, dated 1964 and 1965, thanking a man named Arthur for the miracle on wheels. There were photographs of children standing in front of the Chrysler, their faces filled with a joy that only comes from finding freedom. These weren't just mission reports. They were proof that his grandfather's shop had been the gateway to a new life for dozens of people. Jax found a ledger that listed every modification made to the Mercury 14, written in his grandfather's neat hand. It was a masterpiece of engineering that the world was never supposed to see. As he walked out of the bank and back into the sunlight, Jax felt like a different person. He went back to the shop and turned on the small television he kept in the corner for the news. Usually he just used it for background noise, but today he was waiting for something specific. At noon, the screen flickered and a woman in a professional suit stood in front of the Pentagon. In a historic move today, the Department of Defense has announced the partial declassification of a Cold War program known as Operation Mercury, she said. For decades, rumors have circulated about a secret unit of elite drivers and specialized vehicles that operated behind the Iron Curtain. Today, the government is officially acknowledging the service of these men and women. Jack sat on his workbench, his eyes glued to the screen. They showed a brief, grainy clip of a large car moving through a dark forest, and for a split second, Jack saw the unmistakable shape of the 1964 Chrysler Imperial. The news anchor continued, explaining that a special hearing would be held in Washington, D.C. to honor the surviving members of the unit. Jax knew he couldn't just sit in Tennessee and watch it on TV. He had the ledger, he had the blueprints, he had the letters from the families. He was the only person who could prove exactly how that car had done the impossible. He spent the next 3 hours packing his gear. Elle didn't take much, just a change of clothes and the heavy yellow envelope from his grandfather's archive. He looked around the shop one last time. The chrome and glass that he used to be so proud of now looked empty. He realized that the real value of Volt and vintage wasn't in the expensive computers or the fast cars. It was in the silence of the back corner where the truth had been waiting for him. He climbed into his truck and started the long drive toward the Capitol. As the miles blurred together, Jax thought about Arthur. He thought about the man who had spent his life fixing tractors during the day and building ghosts at night. He thought about the courage it took to stay quiet for 50 years, knowing that he had changed the world, but could never take the credit. Jax felt the weight of the titanium valve in his pocket, a constant reminder of the mission he was on. He drove through the night, past sleeping towns and dark forests, feeling like he was following the same path Martha had taken decades ago. By the time the sun began to rise over the white marble buildings of Washington, D.C., Jax was exhausted, but his mind was clearer than it had ever been. He didn't feel like a small-town mechanic anymore. He felt like a messenger carrying a fire that had been kept under a bushel for too long. He parked his truck near the National Mall and walked toward the massive stone pillars of the government buildings. He saw the camera crews and the crowds of people starting to gather, but his eyes were looking for something else. He was looking for a sign of the Mercury 14. He found it near the entrance of the Smithsonian. The car was there, sitting on a trailer under a heavy black tarp. Even covered up, Jax could feel the power of the machine. He walked up to the guard at the gate and pulled out his ID. "My name is Jax Mercer," he said, his voice steady and strong. "I have the documentation for the Mercury 14. I'm here to testify for the man who built it." The guard looked at the heavy envelope in Jax's hand and then at the silver coin with the winged car. He didn't ask any questions. He simply opened the gate and pointed toward the grand hall. Jax took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of wax and history. He looked up at the high ceilings and realized that he was no longer in the shadows. He was in the light, and for the first time in 50 years, the story of the getaway engineer was finally going to be told. He wasn't just a grandson anymore. He was the witness the world had been waiting for. The hearing room was smaller than Jax expected, but it felt more important than any stadium he had ever been in. The walls were made of dark polished wood, and heavy American flags stood behind a long table where 5 members of Congress sat. The air was cool and filled with the quiet murmur of people talking in low voices. Jax sat in the back row, his hands resting on the heavy yellow envelope. He looked around and saw a sea of silver hair. There were dozens of old men sitting in the rows ahead of him, many wearing their best Sunday suits. Some were in wheelchairs and others leaned on canes, but they all had the same look in their eyes, a mix of pride and a sadness that had been kept behind closed doors for 50 years. Many wore small pins on their lapels or patches on their jackets that showed a winged car. These were the survivors of the Mercury unit, the ghosts who were finally being brought into the light. At exactly 9:30, Martha walked into the room. She wasn't wearing her old canvas jacket today. She wore a simple dark blue suit and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She walked with the same steady military precision Jax remembered from the shop, her head held high. As she passed the rows of veterans, Jax saw something that made his heart swell. One by one, the old men began to stand up. They didn't say a word, and they didn't cheer. They just stood in silence, showing respect for the woman who had led them through the darkest nights of the Cold War. Even Agent Miller, who was standing by the side door, gave her a short, sharp nod as she took her seat in the front row. The chairwoman of the committee, a woman with a kind but firm face, began the hearing by talking about the weight of secrecy. She spoke about the men and women who had served their country in ways that could never be printed in a history book. She admitted that the government had stayed silent for too long and that today was about fixing a mistake that was 50 years old. Then she called the first witness. It was Frank, the old pilot Jax had met at the shop. He moved to the witness table with the help of his cane, his voice shaking slightly as he began to speak. He didn't talk about politics or strategies. He talked about the night in November of 1964. He described the freezing cold of the German forest and the terrifying sound of the border sirens. He talked about the three scientists shivering in the back seat and the feeling of total hopelessness when they saw the first roadblock. Then he talked about the car. He told the committee how Arthur Mercer had modified the engine to run on high-pressure air and how the titanium frame had absorbed the impact of the heavy gunfire. He said that the Chrysler wasn't just a machine. It was a shield that had protected them when no one else could. When he finished, the room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Then the chairwoman called Jax to the table. Jax felt like his legs were made of lead as he walked to the front of the room. He took the oath and sat down, looking at the row of cameras and the powerful people watching him. He opened his envelope and pulled out the titanium valve and the ledger. "My name is Jax Mercer," he began, his voice sounding stronger than he expected. "My grandfather, Arthur, didn't wear a uniform. He didn't have a rank, but he spent his life in a small shop in Tennessee, making sure these men had a way to get home. He showed the committee the blueprints and the letters from the families who had escaped. He held up the titanium valve, the light catching the initials AM stamped in the metal. This part was never on a government inventory list," Jax said. "My grandfather built it by hand because he knew the standard parts weren't good enough for the lives that were on the line. He kept these records for 50 years because he believed that the truth was more important than a comfortable lie. He wanted the world to know that these people were real and that their sacrifice mattered." The committee members passed the documents between them, their faces changing from curiosity to deep respect. They looked at the photos of the young soldiers and the technical reports that proved the Mercury 14 had done things that were supposed to be impossible. The chairwoman looked at Jax and then at Martha. "Lieutenant Carthage," she said, addressing Martha by her real rank for the first time. "This committee acknowledges that you and your team operated under conditions that would have broken most people. We acknowledge the injustice of your records being erased. It is our recommendation that the Mercury unit be awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for their bravery in the shadows." Suddenly, the room wasn't quiet anymore. It wasn't a loud cheer, but a sound of shifting chairs as every veteran in the room stood up again. One of the old men in the front row raised his hand in a crisp, perfect military salute. Then another followed, and another. Soon every man in the room was saluting Martha and the memory of the men who hadn't made it back. Jax looked at Martha. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She stood up and turned to face the men she had led, giving them a single, slow nod of recognition. The hearing was adjourned, but no one left immediately. The veterans swarmed around Martha, hugging her and sharing stories that had been buried for decades. Jax stood by the witness table, feeling the weight of the silver coin in his pocket. He realized that his grandfather hadn't just left him a business or a shop. He had left him a seat at the table of history. He had given him the chance to be the voice for the people who had been forced to be silent. As he watched the old heroes finally getting the honor they deserved, Jax felt a deep sense of peace. The secret was out. The ghosts were home, and the Mercury 14 was no longer just a piece of rusty metal. It was a legend that would never be forgotten again. Jax looked at the ledger one last time and realized that the mission his grandfather started in 1964 was finally complete. Jax drove back to Tennessee the next day, the long highway miles feeling shorter than they ever had before. When he pulled into the gravel lot of Volt and Vintage, the shop looked exactly the same. But to Jax, everything had changed. The fluorescent lights were humming, and the smell of old oil and ozone still hung in the air, but now it felt like a welcome home. He spent the entire week reorganizing the garage. He moved the olive drab filing cabinet from the dark corner to a place of honor right behind the main counter. He polished the metal until the green paint glowed, and he left the drawer unlocked so that anyone who was interested could see the blueprints of the Mercury 14. He took the old photograph of the men in the snowy forest and put it in a brand new frame, hanging it right next to a copy of the congressional record from the hearing. The titanium valve and the silver coin went into a small glass display case on the workbench, resting on a piece of dark blue velvet. Jax no longer looked at his digital diagnostic tools as the only way to solve a problem. He started carrying a manual pressure gauge and a brass brush in his pocket, just like his grandfather used to do. He realized that the shop wasn't just a place to fix cars, it was a sanctuary for stories that the world had tried to erase. A few weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, just as the sun was hitting the floor, the bell above the door rang. A young man, barely 20 years old, walked in. He was wearing a flashy racing jacket and carrying a set of keys to a modern electric sports car. He looked around the shop with a smirk, his eyes landing on the old filing cabinet and the rusty tools on the wall. "Hey, I heard you were the best in the state," the kid said, leaning against the counter, "but this place looks like a museum for junk. I've got a software glitch in my motor controller that my tablet can't figure out. Can you actually fix real technology, or do you just polish old scrap metal?" Jax looked at the kid and then at the photograph of his grandfather. He didn't get angry, and he didn't laugh. He reached into his pocket and felt the cool, hard metal of the titanium valve. He walked around the counter and looked the young man in the eye. "Value isn't always something you can see on a screen, son," Jax said quietly. "Sometimes the most important technology in the world is hidden under a layer of rust and 50 years of silence." He walked over to a car sitting in the back, a simple beat-up sedan that a local grandmother had brought in earlier that day. He picked up a rag and wiped a spot of dirt off the door pillar, revealing a serial number. "Every piece of metal tells a story," Jax continued. "My job is to make sure those stories don't get forgotten. If you want me to look at your car, you have to be willing to listen to what the machine is trying to tell you." The young man stopped smirking and looked at the blueprints on the wall. He saw the classified stamps and the drawings of the turbine engine. He looked at Jax's face and saw a seriousness that he wasn't expecting. "Okay," the kid whispered. "I'm listening." Jax smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Good. Let's start with the basics. Some machines are built to be sold, but others are built to save lives. And those are the ones that never really die." As the morning light filled the shop, Jax began to work, his hands moving with the same precision and care that Arthur Mercer had used decades ago. He knew that Martha was out there somewhere, finally living in the light, and that the pilots and agents were finally being remembered. The Mercury 14 was in a museum now, where thousands of people saw it every day. But the spirit of the project was right here, in a small shop in Tennessee. Jax realized that some truths wait a lifetime to surface, and some secrets are worth guarding forever. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a witness. He was a grandson, and he was the new guardian of the ghosts of Berlin. The silence of the shop was no longer empty. It was full of the echoes of heroes, and Jax was finally ready to hear everything they had to say.